is saving grace. Now, how is it that we understand saving grace? And this often shows up with the questions of the Calvinist versus Arminian debates. Lutherans don't fit neatly into either of those categories. And so oftentimes, because of that, people are confused by what we believe. So just some basic points to start us off here. The first is we believe that saving grace is universal, so that God does not only give saving grace to the elect, but God desires the salvation of all, and thus, as he works through the means of grace, he desires to bring all people to himself. But we also confess that God's grace is resistible. In other words, though God desires the salvation of all, it is possible for sinners to resist that grace of God and thus forfeit salvation. The third point in terms of saving grace here is that it is applied through means rather than God's absolute power. And what we're saying here is if God wanted to simply just convert everyone in an instant by his absolute power, of course he could have. It's not like our wills are so powerful that they can resist God. But God could easily just convert us all in a moment. However, there is an understanding that God has, for whatever reason, in God's inscrutable will, has chosen that he would work resistibly, not irresistibly. He would not work by his pure absolute power as he did in creation in terms of our conversion, but instead that he would tie himself to means. So he would work through those means, which we talk about as the means of grace. The fourth point is that faith is granted as a gift. Faith is not something that is the result of human decision or human rationality, but it is something that God does, that the Spirit creates within the people of God through those means of grace. God is the sole cause of conversion. His grace is the sole cause of our conversion. In other words, if I convert to Christianity, I don't get to take credit myself and say, well, I was just really smart. No, if I am converted because God has given his grace to me and God has changed my will so that I have been given the gift of faith and trust in him. Faith and saving grace, in our view, can be walked away from, Galatians 5:4, cut off from Christ. So that there is a possibility, according to Scripture, of the true regenerate believer to walk away from the grace of God. We certainly know many people who have been baptized who are not walking in the faith today. That does not mean that they are still saved, but it also does not mean that their baptism was ineffectual. What it means is that those people have rejected baptismal grace and God's promises and have walked away. Saving grace is no divine necessity, but it's given out of free love. In other words, God is not under any obligation to save humanity at all. God would be perfectly just in just leaving humanity in our state of sin and not offering any grace or salvation. But thankfully, he doesn't do that. Because God is merciful, God is loving, God is self-giving. And so it's not out of any necessity, but out of free and pure unmerited love that God decides to bring salvation to us on this earth. And the final point about saving grace is that, like everything else in our theology, it is grounded in the person and the work of Jesus Christ and him alone.